Sonora is the award-winning author of Little Paranoias, collection of stories, Seeing Things, and more. Her work has been published by Burial Day Press, Candisha Press, Cemetery Gate Media, and others. She lives in Arlington, Virginia, with her husband and a rescue dog. Sonora, over to you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you all very much for having me. I'm going to be reading from the title story of my current collection. It just came out on Tuesday. It's called Someone to Share My Nightmares. So I'll be reading the opening to that story. Kristen's favorite director was in town. He'd been there for almost a month, buried in a grassy knoll at the top of the local cemetery. His stone was the largest, a beacon whose notebooks, flowers, statues, and other items left in tribute cast a gilded shadow on the graves that were unknown to all except their families and friends left behind. Jonathan Ransom had not been born in Kristen's town. He hadn't even lived there. But he made sure he'd stay there in death, buried in Thornhill Cemetery in the small town of Creekwood, North Carolina. Ransom's films were haunting portraits of the South, bringing forth that unsettled quiet that most Southerners only knew as a feeling or a sense of innate displeasure with one's surroundings, a quiet anger they couldn't quite place. Ransom manifested that anger into ghosts, shadows, and monsters. He formed them into shapes, created characters that explained Kristen's deepest suspicions about where she lived. His work was celebrated across the country, and his last 3 films had each garnered more praise than the next. Ransom claimed that in Creekwood he'd found his muse, its empty trees, barren even in summer, and blackened creeks that flowed inches deep brought a mood to his films that actors never could. Kristen knew those scenes well, had known them ever since she first entered the woods that Ransom found delightful. She always tried to see him shoot. He was famous for only shooting at dusk or at dawn, and in the quietest corners of Creekwood that even the locals managed to avoid. If she'd had the chance to meet him, she would have been able to tell him to avoid those corners. Ransom's death was called an accident. A local found him at the bottom of a ditch, and his head was bent in an unnatural angle against the stone. Ransom's camera lay shattered next to him, all the film exposed and ruined. No one would see what Ransom saw ever again. Kristen always knew there was something wrong with the woods outside of her house. Its trees bent at odd shapes, and they never seemed to bear blossoms or fruit. Yet they lived, year in and year out. Birds built their nests in their crevices. Squirrels burrowed in their holes. Eggs fell to the ground before they hatched, and hawks left the bloodied remains of the squirrels on the roots. The forest's horrors began to appear in her dreams as early as elementary school. Kristen would fall asleep, and in her mind, she'd wander into a forest that no longer hid behind the trappings of flora and fauna. Between craggy trees stood corpses, their mouths frozen into a scream as their arms and hands stretched to the sky alongside the branches. The leaves on the forest floor were strewn with hair and teeth. Each nightmare ended with smoke curling at Kristen's feet and the glow of 2 eyes blinking in front of her. When she awoke in the safety of her room, she'd vow to stay away from such a very dangerous place. And yet, Kristen couldn't stay away. She'd walk by the woods and feel as if the smoke in her dreams were nipping at her ankles like a wolf puppy, welcoming her into its wild domain. And when she entered the woods, she felt an eerie sense of calm, like whatever had beckoned her was grateful for the company. She knew when she was welcome and when she should leave. It was as if the demon the eyes in her nightmares belonged to allowed her in so long as she listened to their whispers and left when they told her. All of his fans mourned his passing, but Kristen also mourned the loss of someone else, perhaps the only someone, who understood those woods the way she had. When Jonathan Ransom spoke of the forests of Creekwood, it had been like listening to her own thoughts made clear. Whenever she'd shared them with anyone, they called her ridiculous or, at best, said she had the potential to write horror. Jonathan Ransom wrote horror, but what made his horror so compelling was his belief in it being real. Not a belief in monsters or ghosts, but a belief in something sinister, something made manifest in the limited ways people could see it. Kristen saw it in her nightmares. Ransom gave her nightmares life. Kristen knew deep down that the woods were the woods. She wouldn't give in to the seductive pull of the nightmare of the forest until she told herself emphatically that it was a nightmare, a fantasy she enjoyed the same as any horror film. It was her imagination, one that, until Jonathan Ransom took up residence beneath the grassy knoll at the end of Thornhill Cemetery, she thought she'd shared with someone else. But Kristen wasn't going to the cemetery today. She was going straight to the source of her current pain, the ditch that had taken Jonathan Ransom's life. She walked through the silent woods, quiet even though it was still the afternoon. She carried a rose to leave at the ditch. As she neared the site of Ransom's death, the silence slowly began to slip away. She thought she heard a rustling, but as she got closer, it became a trickle. There were no creeks in the forest, at least not close to here. Kristen entered the clearing where the ditch had once been. In its place was a creek. The stone that broke Jonathan Ransom's neck was now covered by rushing water. Kristen sighed. The rainstorms from the previous week must have left their remnants in the woods. Or else the woods wanted to wash him away from her memory for good. She tossed the rose in the water, then walked away. She'd had enough of the forest for one afternoon. Thank you.